Hi, in this episode, we talk about the vaccine, and we just need to be clear real quick that we are pro-vaccine. We think everybody should get it. We maybe don't agree with mandates, but follow the guidelines, get vaccinated, get boosted, and stay safe.
Do my best. Got it. Got it.
Okay. Welcome to What's My Thesis? I'm your host, Javier Proenza. Every week, my guests and I share the answers we found to the questions we have. Join us as we explore and expand our worldview and ask, what's my thesis? And today, my guest is Emily Blythe Jones, and we know each other. We're actually, we're both members. How do you word Monte Vista?
Yeah, we're members.
We're members of Monte Vista together?
Yes.
Okay. Cool. So we're a step beyond just acquaintances. So I'm excited to have you. And what's it called? Well, first of all, I didn't see you at OPAF, but how was your experience? I did hang out with Kellen a little bit.
Amazing. Were you not there on Saturday?
No, I didn't get to go in Saturday. Go there Saturday. I went on Sunday.
We just swapped places.
Yeah.
And Justin and Kellen were there Justin came to set up on Saturday, and then Kellen was indisposed because of what do you call it?
Mutilated himself making the piece that he was going to put.
Yeah, making the piece. Blood, sweat, and tears went into that piece. And then I made the mistake of it was basically I just really overbooked myself on Saturday by not being at all used to being able to do more than one thing in any day. I'm just not capable at this point.
I mean, it's always been hard in Los Angeles, even pre-pandemic, to do three things in a day in Los Angeles is a lot.
Too much. Yeah. And I'm not a shut-in. I'm definitely a hermit. I love to be at home because that's where my studio is and that's where I work. And then I'm just constantly working. So it's just like a habit that definitely existed before COVID and then now has just gotten a little bit more intense. But went to OPAF on Saturday, and then that night was the opening at Gallery also. And I had gotten invited by Lesha a week before to be in the show, and I made a new piece, and that felt like $1 million. I'm so grateful that she thought of me. Because it really forced me to just real quick turnaround time, make a piece. And she was like, you could bring anything that you have. You can bring, I love your work. She was very sweet. Bring whatever. And then I was like, well, are you okay with me being a total nut job and making a new piece? And I did.
I just literally remembered that I have this, it's not here, although this is here, the OPAF pin.
Nice.
And then this is the Made in LA pin that I have.
I need more swag. That's so good.
I like these because they're actually they're not a pain in the ass. I've had the Made in LA pin for a while, and it's in terms of swag, it doesn't get too much in the way. I never realized, I don't even use it on, I've pinned it on clothes before, I guess. But anyway, the thing I wanted to bring up is that I have this miniature Powerade bottle that every time it's in my arsenal of shit that's just laying around the house that I keep running into, and it always makes me think of you because I know you like miniaturized
I do like miniaturized things. I totally do. Yeah. I'm making this puppet right now, and it's part of this larger project that is a little bit bonkers and unformulated to put to words. It's very formulated up here. And on paper, I've got a lot. So the reason why I wrote notes for what I wanted to talk about is because I definitely have the tendency to just be I want to talk about all the things. And I get really, bogged down in all of the details. So I'll text people about the new idea that I have about stemming from the guide that I made for Gallery also. And it's ends up being this paragraph that's this long. And, everybody has different ways of consuming material and learning. And for example, Sasha Fishman is my business partner. We're working on starting a business together, and I'll send her texts and she's like, that was a really long text. That was a lot. So I try to be like sensitive to people, but it comes with the territory of how my brain works, and it's a little bit rough.
You would say you're like a little bit scatterbrained? Is that what you're describing? Like,
well, I mean,
what does scatterbrained actually mean? Because I think that's like a pejorative now that I think about it. But I mean, like, it doesn't sound like you're saying you're absent-minded. It just sounds like you're over-connecting, or you're connecting a lot of ideas together, and they might not be necessarily always relevant to the discussion.
I don't think I've ever been accused of not being an intense person. With
well, I mean, I could say that about myself too, but
I mean, we see like, this is an interesting conversation for you and I to have, because I think that there's like, we've talked in person about this. There's like this simmering underlying thing where it's like, we have a lot of thoughts in common. We have a lot of like things about that we see the world about in common. So, yeah, I mean, I'm really stoked about like the renaissance, the important emergence of like discussing mental health as being like one of the big takeaways for us throughout COVID. And it allowed me to like start working with a therapist. And then I ended up talking to my mom, and she was like, oh yeah, I've known you've had ADHD your entire life, but I never told you. And, you know, your brother was having a hard time with it, because it's a lot of people talk about it being genetic. And she's like, yeah, your brother was having some trouble with it, but you were doing fine in school, so we just never brought it up. And I'm like, thanks.
Yeah, why give you something to like stress about? That I think that makes perfect sense.
Oh my God. If I had known earlier in my life, I don't know what would be different. But maybe some things would be different, because it's, you know, I'm 33 years old, and I'm feeling like I'm becoming like this, you know, it feels like being like a middle-aged artist at this point, you know, like I might be young in terms of like life trajectory, but I don't know. There's all these strange trends that occur within like age gaps within the Los Angeles art scene, and I'm sure all around the world. But
like, what do you mean by that? Or what, do you have any examples that come to mind? I know it can be hard to but it's an interesting thing you just said.
Yeah. I mean, I got done with grad school, I think a little bit late. I took like 2.5 years off from school between I got an associate's degree back in Illinois before we moved out here. And then I took some time off. My husband and I got married, took some time off to move out here, and then started undergrad, and then went directly into grad school, which was a 3-year program. So I finished up when I was 28, and then started teaching immediately. And I think that I had this very clear vision that I wanted to be a teacher, and that was like a very pragmatic and also like ethical desire for me. You know, I wanted to pass on all of the goodness that like my other teachers had given me over the years. But I got into teaching, and I realized that, like, possibly just because of the way that my brain works, working within academia and bureaucracy and, you know, if I don't feel 100% engaged with like the ethics of the university or the high school that I'm working in, I'm just like, peace out, guys. I can't.
Yeah, that's going to complicate things, because the ethics are that funding never comes from like the wealthy, moral people of the world, right? Like,
no, yeah. I worked for a high school that was definitely like a private high school, and the amount of money that the students were paying was quite intense. And I had a student one day say something along the lines of, well, I don't need to clean my paintbrushes, even though you're trying to teach me how to like take care of my belongings, my studio equipment. I don't need to clean my paintbrushes. Like, my parents pay this much in tuition, so you can take care of that for me. And I'm like, I can't do this anymore. I loved working within the CSU system, because the students are like my people. Like, it's such a different thing to be connected with the student body at CSU and feel like I really want to support the students. I want to make them feel like their education isn't propagating like an attitude of like the CSU being somewhat of like an underdog school. Like the professors that I had at the CSU that I went to were incredible. Like they had incredible pedigrees. They were like such incredible people, incredible professors. And then a lot of them also like moonlighted at, you know, other private colleges. And so I talked to students a lot. You know, after leaving academia, I kept continue trying to be really engaged with students and talking about, you know, the way that I view all of that, all of the financial aspects of getting an education in art. And I have a lot of big feelings about it. And a lot of it comes from like my political perspective. And I'm speaking to you as if like I'm allowing for you to read behind, like between the lines. And it's like a hard thing because I have a lot of thoughts and I never know how much I want to put out onto the table as far as like talking about it with people, because I'm scared of, in so many different areas of my life, if people knew about like how vitriolic I get about particular aspects of how the art world works or how the education system works, that they would be like, whoa, you're an intense person. And it's like too much to talk to you about this stuff. So
you're worried that I'm going to be like afraid of you?
You're going to judge me so hard.
No, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of academia in the sense that like, I mean, I definitely didn't want, I just think that a lot of it is, you know, I think people are very much really into the idea of expertise being so like the dialogue that's going on around like around doing your own research is so condescending, and it's like what, you went to a fucking institution, you paid billions of dollars, whatever, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Sorry, I'm thinking. I have had Bill Gates on the brain.
Don't we all?
It was just a PBS NewsHour thing where he was just like he go like they asked him like, what did you learn or about like interacting with Jeffrey Epstein, and he goes, well, he's dead. And it's like the weirdest fucking answer. But anyway, I think that there's like a lot of people that, like, for example, there's a lot of people that are like pro science but don't actually know, like, you know, it's more of like, hey, I'm a Democrat, rather than like, hey, I actually give a fuck about what science, and they mock anybody else who would have any critical thinking. Which I think, like, if academia is not about critical thinking anymore, which is what I find interesting, like, I know that I'm wrong about this, but like for a while, I kind of was like, every artist is somewhat of a critical thinker, right? And even though that can be kind of true, like, I think I've discovered that that's not necessarily the case the hard way by doing this podcast and just like interacting with people. And not just that they don't agree with me politically, but just how they, like, so you can tell something about people but through their worldview, right?
Yeah.
Like, and so I just find that academia is it's just cringe is what it is. And then the idea that like Ivy League schools are anything other than institutions that propagate like generational wealth,
right,
and have anything to do with like actual meritocracy, you know, like what's it called? Chris Hedges, he's the guy that quit the New York Times because they wouldn't let him talk about, like, he was anti the Iraq War. And like he had a confrontation with I forget exactly the details. He left and he started doing his own stuff. He's like a really well-respected guy. And I forgot why I brought him up. What was the point I was just making?
I mean,
so Chris
critical
Hedges,
thinking as an aspect of this has been coming up in conversation a lot. Critical thinking as far as like,
oh yeah,
realizing that like these institutions are propping up like the idea of a truth that we're just supposed to just swallow completely. Critical thinking should allow for there to be a bit more less surprise when we find out that the institutions are maybe not telling us entire truths. I don't know if that's the Chris Hedges situation, but I keep hearing.
No, I mean, it doesn't matter exactly what the point was, but because this is still interesting, but just the idea that there is like, it's so frustrating to me how people. I don't even think that they're aware that they're just virtue signaling. I think that they genuinely have this idea of like wanting to have justice, and then but they have no fucking concept of like foreign policy or our history in this country, right? And then going to academia, I think that more and more academia rewards people that are insiders, right? Like the idea that there's a professional managerial class in the country, and like if you're going to school, that's essentially what you're striving for, right? You're like, no one goes to fucking into that much debt so they can be an underling, right? They like these are the people that were able to work from home when the pandemic hit. They didn't lose their jobs, right? Like people that designers and stuff like that, coders, people like that. And I think that there's sort of this like impulse to sort of just want to like validate your existence while everybody else is fucking starving. And then I think that a lot of people have really intense points of views that are incredibly offensive, but they're like openly okay, right? Like where are all the people that were angry at Trump about kids in cages? Like we just watched some fucking Haitian people get whipped by men on horses. Last year was George Floyd. Like I can't process how quickly we got over George Floyd. Like like and all those things. So I don't know. In terms of that kind of political stuff, I find it is really shocking how little critical thinking is part of most education, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I think
Well, I mean, if you think about what the purpose of teaching a student how to do crits in art school, it's supposed to be about like it should be just called critical thinking, like as a class. I mean, that's the things that I missed the most about being a student in grad school was being put into a room where the only purpose of the time spent together was to engage in critical thinking. And if you're only navigating critique and art school as a way to turn your work into a profit-making machine, I think you're missing so many aspects of developing your critical thinking voice and your capabilities of being able to see the world through a more, in my opinion, realistic lens. Because like you can't assume that what is on the surface is going to be the truth, and it takes energy and time. And I feel so privileged in so many aspects of my life, and the opportunity that I've had to be in art school and to like take these critical classes and to be able to like read texts that have expanded my thinking. I took this class when I was like still an undergrad that was called Intercultural Communications. Mm-hmm. And, I was, I think like 23 or 24 when I took this class, and it completely shifted my perspective and allowed for me to start trying to like dismantle a lot of the thought processes that I had operated on since I was, deculted a bit from the intensity.
Wait, you weren't in a cult. You're talking more metaphorically, right?
What do you call really intense branches of the evangelical church?
No, that's fair. So like what church are we talking? Like mega churches?
Yeah, I was definitely part of I was part throughout most of the formative years of my childhood. I was part of like a small but mega church. Like it was like a smaller community, but they operated like a mega church. And that was like the church that I went to, where we went on like mission trips, which is just so offensive to me as like a human adult, where I'm just like, I cannot believe that we did that. I cannot believe that I engaged in that. I have like nothing good to say.
It's essentially colonialism. That's what it is. I mean, that's like why Los Angeles
colonialism. Yeah.
That's why, one of the things that's funny to me, we were talking about OPAF. That place is called San Pedro. not San Pedro.
Yeah.
And Los Feliz, even in English, you can't say, like, you can't, it's not Los Files.
Oh yeah.
You know,
I mean,
and
the simmering underlying tension that is that everything is a colonialist lie that props up like the white capitalist patriarchy. Like all of that is just it's just so apparent and obvious that like it's I think for a lot of people it's like you can't even deal with confronting that in your reality because it's so like changes everything about how you view the world if you ever believed any of that. And I think, you know, I'm still processing all of and trying to like remove from my own way of thinking so many things that I just took for completely, you know, as truth. And realizing like, you know, when we can't sing religious songs for a family funeral because not everybody is religious. So then we go towards singing a patriotic song and that being just as offensive and just as horrifying as singing a religious song is
what's the patriotic song?
Oh, my.
Because I mean, it will put a boot up your ass.
Yeah,
the range is like pretty broad, you know. It can get really specific.
This was no, it wasn't it was America the Beautiful, I think.
Okay, so it's like it's an old timey patriotic song.
Oh yeah, like one of the ones that I learned while I was going to a Christian school.
From when America was actually beautiful and still had like rolling landscapes.
Why? Yeah, beautiful for who?
So, quick question before we get too far into this. I'm sure we'll keep going in this thread, but what was your topic? Was it flowers?
Well, flowers?
No, I was something not political.
Yeah, right. Yeah. No, like, okay, so I mean, it's kind of along the lines of like dismantling our reliance on the academic system as being a necessity in order to improve your skills. Like I still think that there's value in finding a cheap or affordable way to be embedded within like a community of other artists because of even if it's bad, even if you have ups and downs through that process, there are still so many beautiful aspects of being able to increase your critical thinking and also like meet people that are outside of your worldview. You know, it's instrumental. That being said, when I was in college, I took a lot of sculpture classes as a grad student that were critique based. The professor is this incredible person who, Christian Tedeschi, he came from Cranbrook, and he ran his classes very much as Cranbrook does, where it's a critique heavy class, and then gave us the opportunity to be learning skill-based learning outside of his classroom. We had full access to the sculpture lab. It was great. But throughout my college experience, I really wanted to get into figurative sculpting. And there was one amazing teacher that taught like an anatomy class, and I took him for life drawing. But I was basically going through school with this. I was like a painting sculpture interdisciplinary student, but I was a lot more encouraged to focus on painting. And I really valued that because it allowed for me to process my thoughts in a really quick way, and also to experience what it felt like to have crits directed towards honing my voice and not necessarily about like material exploration. Like I needed to get some thoughts worked out while I was in school, and painting was the easiest way to do that. So getting out of school, I started like kind of narrowing down on some of my conceptual interests, but I did not want to be painting anymore, and had gotten some really incredible experiences. Like I got to do the CSU Summer Arts program up in Monterey Bay, and Evan Holloway and Katie Grinnan came because Christian invited them up, and like and then Carrie Reardon, who was also a professor up there, like all just like got this bug in me of like sculpting and mold making as being like the answer for me. And I got out of school and I didn't have access to like some of the the facilities and the materials that the students had. So like, I wish that I had used a bunch of body double to make body castings when I was in school, but I didn't do that. And I got out of school and I needed to teach myself how to sculpt, and I needed to learn anatomy, and I needed to learn like what I wanted to even be saying. And, you know, I'm still doing that.
After your MFA?
This was after my MFA. Yeah. I was making paintings that I just wasn't happy with, and trying to go a little bit more relief and like dimensional with the work, but it just wasn't happening as fast as I wanted it to. So I started doing all of this research into what people within the special effects community do, what people do within like the toy making industry, and then blending that with anatomical study that's done within like atelier programs. Like,
what's atelier?
You know, somebody who goes to Venice, or a program like there's a couple different sculpting programs. Like Laguna College of Art and Design is a really figurative based traditional skills sort of program. So I started following a bunch of people on Instagram, you know, learning about how people implement anatomical study while also combining that with conceptual research. And I just like fell in love with this mode of working, but I couldn't stand the idea that a lot of what people do is they work with materials that are, when you sculpt with them, they're permanent, or they are, you know, water-based clays that need to be fired, or they are impermanent materials that need to have molds made of them. And we have completely moved away from any of the old school methods of making molds. And we are completely like in this cycle of like worshiping petroleum-based products, silicones, as being like the only options that are on the market. And those are incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
And they are non-biodegradable. And so my thesis is just constantly in life trying to teach people that there are alternatives, that if you search out on the internet long enough and do a lot of experimenting and are incredibly privileged to have a space to be doing this work and to be doing all of this research, you can find alternatives. And so my thesis in life has kind of become, I wanted to be a teacher in the academic setting. It didn't necessarily work out for me. I learned a bunch of skills that I could apply to making my own sculptural work. And now I want to find ways to teach them and to like evangelize this process, which is all, you know, ironic considering my background in evangelism. Well, it taught me something.
You don't necessarily have to discard all of your life.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. Yeah.
So that's interesting. So what, like, then is this stuff less toxic to the world, that these alternative materials, or is it mostly going to save money? Is it is like if there's an ecological side to this as well?
Oh yeah.
And that's what you were teaching a class of this at OPAF, right?
Yeah. So Sasha and I met at Monta Vista.
I wanted to say, you, by the way, you are the queen of name dropping names I've never heard.
That's great. That's great. If that means that you get to find some awesome new exciting artists, like, you know what? That's another.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's like, I'm being ironic because it's not a name drop. If it's like somebody that's kind of obscure, you're not like,
that's funny.
Brad Pitt gave me this advice.
That's a huge bent that I have in my work. I'm actually like developing a sort of a side trajectory for something that I want to do with the puppets that I'm making, where I want to talk about arts workers, and I want to talk about visibility of people that are instrumental in your own development as an artist, and creating citations for the people that help make the art world go round. And I think that because I was involved for so many years, you know, I've been working since I got out of grad school, and even before that, as studio assistants for various people, as I have kind of graduated to being interested in looking at my skill set as being like good for fabrication. And now I want to completely abandon fabrication for consultation and education, implementing this whole system that is the eco-friendly mold making system. But I'm like, in the effort of being like an evangelical, how do I reach the most amount of people? Mm-hmm. And I don't think that fabricating for one person or a couple of different artists is the best use of my time. So Sasha Fishman and I met at Monte Vista last year. And then, I'm sorry, wow, that was 2020.
It could have been 30 years ago. It's fine.
I know, right?
That's how it feels.
We met at the Monte Vista open call because she was in that show. And like, we made, that connection. We were like, oh God, we have to be friends. This is so incredible. It's so exciting because she's doing research into bioplastics and casting materials.
What's a bioplastic?
A bioplastic is a really complicated concept because they're not necessarily biodegradable in the way that we think about it. There's like different classifications of plastics that are being created. Like avocado, biodegradable, you still have to have very specific conditions in order for the plastic to be compostable. And compostable is the thing that we are both aspiring to. Compostable is like the top tier of bioplastics, where that the material that you are creating and using is going to completely disintegrate without having to be put under certain circumstances. Does that make sense?
So you don't spend extra electricity trying to save the world, because that's one of the ironies of recycling, right? Like, it's like, first of all, it doesn't fully recycle the plastic, and then it burns like so much carbon.
Yeah, and so she's doing all this incredible research into like chitosan and agar, and she at one point adopted some hagfish from this farm up in Monterey Bay and like lived with these hagfish that produce a slime and
is the hagfish ugly?
Oh, it's so ugly. But they're kind of cute because they're so ugly.
They're like pugs. Oh, the pugs of fish.
Oh yeah.
What a brutal name though, hagfish.
Yeah. They're miraculous things, and you'll have to look up what hagfish can do. But she's doing research into that, and then I'm doing research into the flexible alternatives for like silicones. And I started working with this recipe that I found on YouTube, and it's just glycerin and gelatin. And, it took me some time to kind of figure out what materials are compatible with being cast into that. But I have finally figured that out, and it can be used as a molding material for like clay, water-based clay. So like, I'm freaking out about this process because it's basically I got a kiln last year. It's basically allowing me to make ceramics without ever having to consider having like permanent rigid plaster molds. And like, plaster is not, it's not the most toxic or, environmentally damaging material, but it's definitely not damaging. There are mining processes that have to go into getting plaster materials that like it's not great. And the gelatin component of my mold making material, of course, is porcine based.
Porcine? Is that horse based?
Pigs. Like it's just Knox gelatin, and it's you're using something that's part of the waste stream of producing what we eat. And I view it as a really unfortunate necessary evil, in terms of like, I'm not personally vegan. I'm trying to eat as often vegetarian as I can. But like, I still will eat meat occasionally, and I will eat fowl because they are one of the better things to be eating if you're going to still be eating meat, or I'll eat fish.
Why are they better in terms of health?
In terms of environmental
is poultry different from fowl?
No, poultry. Yeah. Fowl. Yeah.
I'm not. I don't know what the vegetarian. I was literally thinking while you were saying that it was made from pig. I was like, oh, then that's perfect. I eat the shit out of a pig.
I love some good pork. Oh God. Yeah. It's real hard. And I love beef, but I'm trying not to eat that much because my family was in the dairy industry growing up back in Illinois. And like engaging with cows, you're just like, oh, they're just like our dogs, and so are pigs. And it's, I mean, it's that's the emotional component, but
I
like
would
the
eat a
entire,
fucking dog though. That doesn't convince me.
yeah, that's another one of
The
those
only thing
things.
I wouldn't eat is a cat because like I feel like cats are like cunning and cool, and I would feel weird about that personality. But if like I don't know, maybe if I find someone obnoxious enough, I would eat them too. No, I'm
That's
kidding.
hilarious. My husband and I have been talking about if the whole like petri dish human flesh becomes viable as like a thing to eat, and it's proven that like it's not going to have any sort of genetic like malfunction. We're not going to have kids for a multitude of reasons, but like, would you eat it or would you not? And like, I don't know. I mean, I'm
I don't
very
know.
curious about it.
I'm feeling a little bit dubious now that the vaccine involves so many. Like when the vaccine came out, I was like, "Oh shit, it's over." And now that they're like boosters and whatnot, I'm like, "Oh, dude, you want me to keep getting stuck?" I don't know, dude.
I got the Johnson and Johnson, so I've gotten one, and I will go on the record as like if I'm the person that ends up being the reason for some sort of zombie apocalypse because I'm part of the Johnson and Johnson crew, like, oh well. I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, bro, I don't really trust these motherfuckers. If they had like shared it with the world, then I'd be like, oh yeah. But
Yeah.
like the idea that they need me to keep going and they're gonna keep making money off of it. I don't know.
Hey,
I'm
critical
not
thinking.
anti-vax. I just don't know. I'm like at this point, I think that you have better immunity if you get it. And I'm like, the motherfuckers that got it are the smart ones.
Jesus Christ. I critical thinking makes this whole situation very challenging, and I have family members that are like actually anti-vax, and it's
Yeah.
emotionally exhausting to a point where like I think about it and I just want to like curl up in a ball and just it's tough.
Yeah, I'm in a different place because I don't have like any like I don't really interact with anybody that is like straight up a Trumper that isn't like Hispanic, you know, and so I can understand how like with the baggage of racism and stuff, but like I don't know. I think that like in terms of critical thinking, I was not a critical thinker when the vaccine came out. I was just like, yeah, anything that fixes this,
Yeah.
Whereas now I'm starting to see like, I can definitely understand how people like whatever. I'll probably end up getting the booster shot, whatever. I'm not like I've already gotten stuck by this shit, you know.
You're already signed up. You're already
Yeah, but
buckled
like
in.
but so and I know that people are saying that people get it, and I know that it's a small percentage. All I'm saying is that like for me, what gets me crazy, and this is my problem, right? Like I get more triggered by the people that get triggered by the people on the right, right? And for me, I'm just as guilty of the same shit that they are, right? Like they're like it's like you're not fucking minding your own business to some degree where I'm like getting pissed off at people that are like um like Russia Gators and all of that, like that whole thing where people were getting like really invested and like, oh, he's a traitor instead of just like a douchebag, right? Like
Oh,
for so many people, it had to escalate because he was this like white racist piece of shit guy, and then but at the same time, like so many minorities were for him, like so many Mexicans. So many like Latinos of all fucking stripes, like like it's funny to me because there's this like misconception that like Cubans are the Republicans. It's like, bro, every fucking Latino culture was Catholic, has had, like we're part, we're subject to the missions that also existed here in California before the Americans took that shit over. Like that's how deep that shit goes. So like, there's a lot of people that aren't pro-abortion. That like, there's a lot of brown people, right? That the people that sit and they're like, oh, think of the brown people. When that guy comes around, when the Trump brown person goes, it's like fuck you. And to me, that sort of denotes of like this dismissal of like people based on opinions rather than like actions. You get what I'm saying? Like I get really frustrated with like just like. But anyway, the point that I'm also
people
making,
aren't able to see the humanity behind anyone at this point, and there's there's so much tribalism that's being encouraged, and to not have critical thinking being at the heart of how you like engage with other people around you, and like to understand what their background is. I have a different perspective on that because I was such a different person half a lifetime ago, and I think there's so many stereotypes that are still applied to people that come from the Midwest and that come from an evangelical background. And like, I don't want people to think about who I am based on who I was in the past. And like the idea of past selves being enough to have a person like lose access to being treated like a human being is really interesting. Like there's so much about like that aspect of our culture right now, but like we're all just not treating each other like humans at this point. And it's
and I guess what I'm working on myself is just sort of not getting triggered by people getting triggered like that. Like I it's not that I get triggered, but I'm just like, shut the fuck up, like let fucking people live. Like you're not perfect, especially when like for me, like people that were like, okay, the extreme of like that shit that people are like, oh, these people shouldn't get healthcare, or the people taking dunks on people for ivermectin, right? Where it's like there's like it's just it becomes it's this tribalism that like for me when I was a kid, I remember when I was like in college, I was still a kid, but like during the Iraq War, there was this whole fucking push by people like Rachel Maddow and all these people, and Mark Maron was part of it. There was this a radio station called Air America. What's his name? He fucking died. The Ed Buck, I think. No, Ed Buck is that fucking horrible person that drugs people. Anyway, the point being that like back in that era, the culture war was really just one sided, right? Like the culture war, the Bill O'Reilly.
Sorry, I have to yell at my dog to get out of the room because he's like panting, and I'm worried somebody's going to think that something illicit is happening in the background. You need to go. Bubs. He is this big, huge mastiff, and he's just so loud. I'm gonna text my husband and ask him to like get him out of the room.
He's distracting you because I can't hear him.
Oh, you can't?
No,
okay.
No. But anyway, so like at that point, I was very much engaged, and I was really angry about because I had left the country and I'd come back. And I'd seen how crazy everything was. But there was really a huge push to make a competitive Fox News, right? Like and
a competitor to Fox News?
Yeah, and a competitor to like all that like Rachel Maddow is homies with Roger Ailes, right? Mm. Like so with the right back then it was Bill O'Reilly, Beck was a big deal. All of these, like, and then Rush Limbaugh, all of these motherfuckers were like huge, and then Rachel Maddow and all of these people, they were trying to become like competitors in that space, right? So for me, when I see like people now on the left, like getting caught up into these arguments about culture that are like are so irrelevant, it's like, okay. Here's what drives me crazy. People that just sit there and point out hypocrisy on the other side. I'm like, that's like part of being human. I just
think that the problems are so much bigger. Like we're getting lost in the sauce. Like,
yeah,
I think we're in a situation where the problems are so much bigger than anything that we can deal with unless we find some ways to recognize that like everybody is at a certain point living a hypocrisy filled.
And that's exactly what I'm saying. Like I am frustrated. My frustration with people that are frustrated with other people is no higher pursuit than their frustration. It's equal waste of time, right? Like I'm not saying that I'm better. I'm just saying based on the shit that I have built my worldview on, this is what triggers me. And the same thing is happening in that instance with other people, right? Like for me, and to me, that's hopefully going to be a healthier space, which I'm striving to do. But goddamn, motherfuckers, be like, you know, oh, they're so like it's like the black squares things during the George Floyd thing. That sentiment, you know, like that is like what keeps happening towards everything, and it drives me insane, right?
Yeah,
like,
virtue signaling is like a real issue that I feel like I wish more people discussed openly. Is like, do I virtue signal? Can I see this in myself as being something that I need to work on? I forget if it was Brad Trammell or if it was somebody else that I got this from, but I think it was another guy, but they were talking about like this idea of like, why does it benefit us as animals to be constantly distracting ourselves with what's going on and finding like a person or a thing as far as like the news trends go to create that sense of community, and like how messed up that can become and how quickly destructive and toxic that isolation of a person where we can like as a community have catharsis in, you know, removing the toxin, removing that from our zeitgeist, that like that becomes this thing that becomes more of a problem than a lot of other behaviors that we're seeing on social media. Like what happens when all of a sudden we learn that maybe as a society we were wrong? Like we're discovering so much about, you know, the way that we thought about the 90s and late or early 2000s, like pop stars, you know, like why can't we apply that mode of thinking like, oh, maybe we had the perspectives about, and that's coming up about like Monica Lewinsky right now because of the show that's on. Like,
wait, what show?
There's a new show on HBO that's about Monica Lewinsky and that whole story, and realizing like, God, there was this line in one of the articles that I read where they were talking about the scathing discussion within feminist circles about Monica Lewinsky in the 90s. And that was what the tools that those feminists had provided to them. Like, I think that the problem is that we're not recognizing that we as various generations have not had all of the tools that we've needed to recognize the problems that we are having, to preemptively see them as being problems, and to like prevent us from like cannibalizing ourselves as a society. Like we gobbled up Monica Lewinsky as a person that we could put all of our negative feelings about what had happened, the degradation that we felt of our country being the laughing stock for, you know, what I think a lot of people perceived as being the first time at the you know, the hands of a Democrat, whatever. And so they're talking in this article about like how horrible these feminists were in the 90s when they were talking about Monica Lewinsky. And now it comes out that like at one point they were like, yeah, she was having like, you know, she had a history of having affairs with men, and like she was, you know, she was troubled and she wanted this. They said in this article that I read something along the lines of, oh, and she had a 5-year affair with an older man. That means that she was 16 when she was having an affair with an older man. That's statutory rape.
Yeah. So she, but then they're giving her agency as a 16-year-old. She's a fully formed human being, fully formed woman who can make great decisions. Even at 22, she was way too fucking young for that.
Yes,
you know, for the most powerful man in the world.
Absolutely. So, like, what are all of the things that we're going to realize, and it's happening so much faster right now, which I think is part of the whiplash effect. Like, we can't keep up with how fast we are having to reconcile how horribly fucked up everything is and what travesties we have committed. You know what I mean?
Continue to commit. I mean, it's just like the lists of the shit that happens is insane.
Yeah.
But going back to, so you said something. I don't think it's when you said that art students have different generational trends, because I think that like one of the things that gives me a lot of frustration is that while there is a generation of like, there's a generation of boomers and they are fucking set in their ways. There's a generation of Gen Xers who kind of, I'm at the tail end of that. They kind of made the tech world. That's their, like the Silicon Valley, that's sort of a Gen X virtue, right? I think that's the generation that Bill Gates probably falls into, if I were to guess. But either way, huh?
Not boomer?
He might be everybody that was working for him.
Yeah, he worked with some smart Gen X.
Yeah, like all of his underling coders, right? But anyway, and then you have the millennial generation that just grows up consuming all of that shit, right? But like what Gen X was really about was this apathy. Like, I mean, if you look at like fucking the artwork of like Nirvana and the shit that was really popular in the early 90s, 91 to like 96, it started to get into this like techno music, started to become cool around like 96, 97, right?
Apathy and disillusionment, right?
Yeah, that was like a marketable thing for the Gen X generation, right? So I'm wondering. So one of the things that makes it really difficult for me is that it seems like the Gen Z crew and the millennial crew are pretty aware of like the evils of capitalism, the evils of neoliberalism, but at the same time, I feel like they get caught up in this effective, like the idea of how, like, if there's ever good, what's that?
Performance?
No, I'm just being careful how I say it because I don't want to like disparage a whole generation.
I mean, I think that the millennials were the first generation that had to reconcile the idea of us constantly being in a performative state and like the affect that you're talking about as being something that, despite the fact that we might be aware of more than maybe the Gen Xers were, that we are so mired down in what it is to engage with the world in a way that's not going to get us in trouble with our families or with our jobs. Like, there's so much performative affectation that completely is stymieing any further forward momentum that I think that might be possible if that was not something. But like, it's so impossible to separate those two things. Like, we have access to a larger voice.
This might get me canceled, but okay. But I think that all right. At my job, I work in a retail outlet that sells musical instruments, so I know people that are younger, and I've interacted with them, and I know of people that I work with that are younger, and the ease with which grooming gets thrown around when you're like 3 years older than somebody and you guys knew each other in high school, or 2 years older, 1 year older, like it's getting fucking weird where it's like, even if they didn't have a relationship until after, if they knew each other, like, and to me,
are you saying the generational gaps are causing cycles of grooming to?
No, I think that there's this like overcorrection, which tends to be like, it's like sort of like, oh, everybody's been so fucking grimy, we need to overcorrect. But at the same time, you're canceling kids that are like kids too, right? Like, if someone who's 22 is not a fucking 40-year-old that's dating a 17-year-old, someone who's like, I'm not condoning that shit, but I'm just saying, like, there seems to be a loss of perspective because the perception is coming from, and I'm not just talking about that, like, that's a very specific example that I thought of while you were talking about, but I think that there's also this like if we're ever going to fight the capitalist system, at some point we're going to have to work with racists, at some point, because like that's, and I think that that's an effective tool of like propaganda that comes from establishment, where it's like, if you have, I've heard many people talk about this, but you can't go on a shop floor and say, hey, who voted Republican? Okay, you guys can't be part of our union. And one of the things that really fucked up the country was that when unions were being formed, they didn't let black people unionize, right? That really affected the labor movement. So in those terms, I think that there is a well-intentioned sort of desire to fix the past, right? Where it's this idea of like, we need to be anti-racist. That's questionable to me because I don't see anybody being anti-racist. Like, anti-racist isn't even a fucking word people use a year after a guy was murdered, and we were all very upset about it. I understand not wanting to think about it, but the anniversary just, I don't even remember when the anniversary happened, but it did. And when it happened, I remember noticing that, like, no one fucking talked about it, right? I thought with all the protests, that would definitely be something that you would hear more and more about, right? Like protests in every state. So
you feel personally changed by what happened? And
do I feel personally changed by what happened with George Floyd?
I mean, I have this hope that a lot of people feel personally changed by reconciling that they were not aware and that they did get the opportunity to learn and grow and educate themselves. But like, sometimes I'm accused of being an optimist about certain things, and like it's balanced out by complete pessimism in lots of others. But, I'm hoping we watch a lot of Netflix shows with a very strong critical thinking sort of guideline underneath all of it. And there is this trend towards terraforming millennial Gen Z consumption, terraforming and paving the road for critical thinking in regards to racial aspects, gender aspects, and because of the prevalence of what I'm seeing, maybe not necessarily well done, but there are more dollars being spent towards trying to create an atmosphere of learning in those regards that like.
What do you mean by dollars spent? Sorry, because that triggers a lot of different ideas of what, like, is a donation, like GoFundMe's and stuff, or what do you mean by dollars spent?
Oh no, I mean like the capitalistic like control over like who does it benefit to create the diversity of voices when they are reacting to a social movement that can be looked at as being like incredibly troubling, where it's like, why are we letting these corporations affect the zeitgeist and affect the trends? But at the same time, if people are being bullied into increasing the amount of voices that are present for having these conversations, that hopefully that means that like the pendulum swing is going to correct, if not overcorrect, and then need another pendulum swing. Like, I don't know. There are aspects of optimism that I try to hold on to. And in regards to like trying to have optimism when I'm firmly in the camp that like all of this is pointless because like most of us are not going to be around in a couple years, like because of the climate crisis. Like of course, that sounds terrible. That's
no, but I think that we're in the right. We're in agreement with each other, because I do think that like while you're saying the pendulum, how many swings of the pendulum are there left though?
Well, they're happening so fast now, and they're gonna. I think that they're gonna keep. I think along with everything in our world right now, everything is gonna keep speeding up. And I think that it's gonna be sped up by recognizing the fact that like the lower socioeconomic classes are going to be the most impacted by climate change, and that when we start reconciling like why that is a situation, it's going to cause some real moments of like, well, how did we get into this mess? I hope that that means that we can correct some of the problems. I'm just balancing out every day feeling like hopeless and like optimism is foolish, you know?
Yeah, I definitely feel like things are. I mean, I have a pretty. I am a person that, because of my mental illness issues throughout my life, I have become very comfortable in both being happy and having no hope. Right? Like,
Sure.
and I'm not saying this isn't even like a discussion about like what's right or wrong. I actually am enjoying this because it's helping me think about certain things. But so the performative thing, I'm just worried that the movements, the cultural movements that we're seeing are not building solidarity in the way that, you know, like, I think that, and I don't think that that is not by design. I don't think it's an accident that you're seeing faces like not Brianna Joy Gray, but Joyanne Reed, and people like that who are essentially like right wingers that are Islamophobes, homophobes, are you know, recently or like 2020, and these are the people that represent the left. And I think there's a reason you're seeing people of color like that are divisive. Like, all you have to do is think of Candace Owens to know that, like, there's different varying degrees of people that are elitists who, you know, like Obama, who is like who owns however many yards in Martha's Vineyard. Like, yes, he's a black man, but how closely related to an average black person's experience is his current life like now, right? There's a lot of talk about how you know, when you become wealthy, you lose empathy, right? And so this is not to say that Obama is like a bad person or anything like that. It's just the way that I think when you're wealthy, there's an understanding that wealth protects wealth. And for them, it's easy to talk about racial justice. It's easy for them to talk about, you know, sex being or I'm trying to think about like LGBT rights. I'm trying to think about the way to phrase that, and all of that. It's really easy for them to talk about it. If they start talking about helping poor people, they're betraying their class.
It's all class warfare. It's all
exactly. And so what concerns me about what I'm seeing with this, like, I don't want to call it cancel culture, because I don't think that that's like what the kids are doing. I think that they're genuinely trying to like fight for justice, but ultimately it serves oppressors, right? Does that make sense?
100%. I mean,
okay.
And having a very difficult and like rich conversation about all of this, it benefits the powers that be to not allow for this to be an easy conversation for any of us to have, because this aspect of class warfare has leaked into so many different aspects of how we are interacting with the world around us. I mean, like, it's impossible at this point for us to weed out what has been created in order to keep us separate from each other, and in order to recognize that like all of this just benefits a further striation, a further removal of the ruling class from everybody else. And you know, when you look at the way that like our media is oriented, it's all about creating those divisions. It's all about, you know, how can we create all of this inner fighting, inner tribalism, so that we can have distractions from like the things that are actually the problems. And not to say that any of these small things are not massive problems that need to be dealt with, but how did they start? They started because of, I mean, I've been reading a lot more since graduating from school, and like getting to read my own texts and learning about, you know, what political views I hold, and just getting really great recommendations from people, and trying to look at social media as being like an educational tool, and being open to listening to people's voices from like all over the place. That can be really hard because it's so vitriolic right now. But, you know, like there's a book called American Nations, and it's about the 11 nations that actually the United States is actually constituted by. Like that was a really big thing for me because it talked about generational cycles, and how, you know, a generation ago in one place looked completely different than a generation in another, based on the location in the country, because of who settled those places, and who what, you know, what political beliefs, what religious beliefs were planted in those places, and like giving each other like that understanding of like, oh, that those were the tools that you were given by your previous generation because of where you grew up, where you're from, what people thought about in that place. And like, even if you were counter that culture, it came from that place. And like giving each other that like that gift, that generous gift of like trying to have empathy and understanding. It feels like that's something that's lacking. And like, I'm sure I could do better about that in numerous different ways. And then this other book that I'm checking out from the library, if everybody should know about Libby, the app where you can use your library card and then get library books either to read or to listen to. And I've been listening to this book, People's History of the World, which was endorsed by Howard Zinn. I forget what the guy's last name is, but Chris something. And like, it basically walks through the trajectory of the human experience, starting from primitive communism, and why the idea that like things are the way that they are and they have to permanently stay this way is just this incredibly destructive myth that is 100% supported. Like the 1917 socialist rebellions that were going on across Eastern Europe, like they had power, they had momentum, but they were effectively completely dismantled because of like capitalist greed and need, and drawing those boundaries between these different countries to allow the amassing of wealth within those countries. Like we have in us as a people the possibility for great change. And like, maybe it doesn't look like something like what we've read about in the history books because one thing or another didn't work because capitalism is all controlling. But like, to say that these things don't work or can't work, or to not allow ourselves to be futuristically leaning, is like, we are not comfortable right now living in the past because the past has too much
baggage.
Pain. Yeah. The past has so much pain for like so many different reasons, for so many different people. And it has so much shame. Like we all feel varying levels of pain and shame, and like looking back at where we've gone. And then the future is also so hard to see because everything feels so hopeless. And if we can't solve some of the bigger problems, thinking about the future is impossible. But like, look at the sci-fi that's being made right now. It is all reductive. It is all just cyclical of like old ideas. Like that's like Star Wars being called sci-fi. Star Wars is a fantasy, and it's not speculative. It's not futuristic. It's about retelling old stories in a new way. And like, maybe it was a big deal at the time.
It's about retelling Akira Kurosawa's stories.
Exactly. So like this idea that like right now there's this optimism in me that what if we do find alternate ways, like storytelling on YouTube, or on like people having incredible art experiences that they let people see from like the comfort of their own phones, as far as like speculative futuristic media that's being produced and that has like new what is like the streams before streams. There's the little tiny bodies of water that flow. All of these streams start amassing and creating
creeks,
smaller than that.
Okay.
something smaller.
You
had a lot of that.
This isn't a quiz. Go on, finish your point.
We had a lot of that in the Midwest, and I wish I remembered. I'm frustrated with media right now. I'm frustrated right now with my inability to deal with the fact that like I have ideas and I want to work and collaborate with other artists, but I'm having capitalist, problems where like access to being able to expand into some of these stories that I want to tell is hindered by like, first of all, me learning about, the way that the ADHD brain works. It's like really difficult to get ideas formulated enough to get people to want to buy in or like jump on. And then also just like gendered self-confidence aspects. Like there's a lot going on there that I'm trying to work through and like confront. There's a lot of like the arts worker stories that I want to think about. And like, there's a lot of different, like, I feel barriers to entry that I want to confront and then find ways to hurdle over them. But right now we're just like lost in the sauce. We're just lost in like the hurting of thinking about the past and like how difficult the present is. So it's like an act of like rebellion to be thinking about the future right now and to be thinking about it in a way that feels like inclusive and intersectional and like right. Like it just feels like it's a challenge that I feel like more of us should be taking on, and it incorporates the idea of critical thinking being like this merit producing endeavor. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And it makes me think about something, like a couple of things. One of the things that I thought that I think is interesting is when you were talking about how like going to school and learning how to think critically. I definitely agree with you with it being valuable. However, one of the things that I kind of have an issue with, like art academia, is sort of this idea that there are institutions. I'm not going to name names, but there are definitely institutions that they are basically teaching in they're teaching art as if it existed in a non-capitalist society.
Oh, absolutely.
And it, it's not invalid to sort of teach people to think outside of the capitalist value system to help them maybe say something a little bit different. I think it can be a little tricky when it's an institutionalized philosophy. However, there is a moral and ethical issue with like charging people insane amounts of money. Like if the schools were fucking free, we're talking private schools. We're not talking about the UCs. We're not talking about CSUN. Definitely not talking CSUN. So no, but you get what I'm saying. Like there is this sort of like it's fucking unreasonable.
we could have an entire many-hour-long discussion critiquing the various aspects of just the Los Angeles-based private and public schools. And
I would say this is pretty fair. And then there's also, going into like what we were talking about, there's still like, here's where I think is fucking legit. Like, like whatever. I would fucking probably love it if I was a professor and every year there were a crop of new freshmen and they were, hot little 18-year-old girls, but they're adults so I can fuck them.
Oh,
however,
God.
That seems a little fucking shady, right? Like, didn't I sound like a creep with that fantasy? But that's a fucking reality, dude. And so for me, like, there's a lot of different issues with that, but like, that is like, I know a woman who left academia because she was asked to give someone who was a professor's special friend a better grade because, It was her special friend. And like she got so fucking pissed off she left. And I don't know what she's doing now, but anyway.
Wow, this whole conversation, thinking about it in terms of like trying to find ways to talk about issues that are really like exciting to talk about in like private.
I'm a podcaster. I have no boundaries when it comes to what I can and can't talk about.
Wild. That's why, my husband and I have such like insane conversations always. Everything that comes up on our phones, everything that comes up like while we don't really watch too much like mainstream media at this point. But like it's all up for discussion. It's all up for grabs. And then we have friends.
Are you saying you don't want to be the one in this conversation defending groomers after I framed it that way, which is totally fine. I'm mostly joking.
I think that there are nuances and ways to distinguish between predatory behaviors and like legitimate, relationships. And that line is really difficult to navigate. And
is there not always the possibility of there being some abuse of power and influence?
I would say yes, especially when the age gap is a thing. And I think that like when we start recognizing that like as a human species that we're maybe not capable of seeing that the human brain is still developing until, forever. And the idea that like a 38-year-old is somehow the same as an 18-year-old when there's a 20-year gap, and saying like, oh, well, that's fine because that's an adult. Like there's so much of a power dynamic to discuss.
I have no problem with the same two people, like a professor and a hot 18-year-old meeting in a bar and just having a conversation. I'm having fun, obviously. I do enjoy how saucy this conversation is. But anyway, I have no problem with them meeting in a bar and hooking up and having a great night. She is an adult.
Don't mistake my like being recorded and being like aghast and not knowing how to confront this conversation while like, on your podcast as me being like at all prudish.
No. I'm just going to go apply forward. You can do it. You can react however you feel comfortable. But here's what I'm saying. I don't think that that's a fucking problem. However, I do think it's a problem because in a bar, that same fucking 38-year-old is just an old fucking guy. He's got to work for it. In the fucking classroom,
I see where you're going with that.
Artist motherfucker in that room, in a fucking scenario where there are all these young artists and they're like, oh my God, I want to learn so much about art. And he knows so much. Like, if I think about my art identity and like what I knew about my voice when I was a BFA, bro, if MFA, I'll let that slide. MFA is fine.
I have a really like interesting experience, like personal experience, and I'm sure a lot of women do, and like maybe men have from like viewing it happen to their peers. Maybe they had it experience themselves. There is definitely like probably an unfair.
Are you friends with Mary Kay Letourneau's husband?
No, what?
Oh yeah, no. That's a generation. See. If I even, you're like, what's less than 10 years younger than me.
I'm an elder millennial.
That's a generational fucking like, whoosh, right?
I'm so sorry. Sorry.
But I'm using that as a point of like how like even like just that 10 years, how much of a fucking difference that makes.
A huge difference.
What does a fucking professor have to talk to an 18-year-old fucking girl who's interested?
They have sex jokes to tell, which is what happened with me. I was in like a printmaking class with my favorite teacher in my, back in Illinois in this like very out in the suburbs, out in like the borderline rural suburbs. And my older professor would, walk into a room of a bunch of 18-year-olds having a great time telling jokes and ramp up the conversation by like well, what's your dirtiest sex joke? Like, and I had some great ones. I know some really good. I'm proud of that ability. Like
and we can get to those.
I'm not very good at telling jokes. I'm not a very funny person, but I love a good sex joke that doesn't hurt anybody.
Yeah.
Doesn't have to hurt anybody. I don't want to hurt anybody with my humor. But that along with slapstick, I really, really love people actually getting hurt in slapstick. My husband makes fun of me a lot.
That took a dark turn. Wait, so then the teacher was like kind of trying to egg you on with sex jokes?
Oh yeah, totally. Like, it was definitely like a borderline not appropriate situation that I think back now on, and I'm like, we would be in the room with each other, like maybe by ourselves, because I just loved being in the print studio and like telling jokes, and like when people are leaving and like it's nothing ever happened. I'm really like fortunate that nothing happened in that instance. Like, I'm not sitting here saying like I'm calling out this person, but at the same time, realizing that there is definitely like lines that can be crossed because of this power structure where like I want to impress my older cool teacher, so I'm going to be pushing boundaries, and like then him being okay with doing that, like it very easily can slip into a place of like being very inappropriate, where it is about the power structure. It is about the dynamic of a young student not necessarily knowing any better about the behaviors that they're exhibiting. Like, I'm being very diplomatic in this whole discussion, but like I see there's so many power structure dynamics within like academia that are fostered in tons of different behaviors, not just when it comes to like sexuality and like, there's.
And full disclosure, I did have a teacher try to take my girlfriend from me. It didn't work. And I laughed at him. And I was like, you're a fucking creep. But that did happen. So maybe that informs my opinion of the whole thing, but I still think it's skeezy.
You're a little spicy. Yeah.
I still think the whole thing is skeezy. I'm glad that none of my friends that I know that teach are that kind of person. But yeah, man, it's like, bro, you can't impress women outside of school that you're a teacher, Like, you can't. You're going to the pool of people that are getting their degrees, and maybe especially I know I said MFAs. I don't mind so much because they're adults, but even then, it's like
they're adults.
They're adultish,
They're adultish.
Dude, if I had a fucking affair with an older woman, with my older professor, I don't know that I would have come out of it okay.
Yeah.
It's a mind fuck. It's a mind fuck. Somebody that like, I know that we tend to think of like, going back to like the Monica Lewinsky, tend to think of women as like the temptress and all of that, but I don't know, dude. The older I get, and then that goes back to that thing about like that I was talking to you about, is like about sort of my it's not a frustration, but it's just like where I get a little bit like drained of hope, is the idea that like I feel like there are younger people that I talk to that are in the same place politically in terms of critical thought that I was when I was their age. And okay, the cultural moment is different for them. What everybody's excited about, when I was in college, Bush was a horrible thing.
Yeah.
Like, I still believe Bush is way worse than Trump. And I know that a lot of people have a hard time with that. But I could go through and explain to you why he is worse than Trump. I can go through and explain to you why Biden is a worse for communities of color than Trump. Biden, I can tell you why fucking Kamala Harris is a bad choice over these people, right? Trump was a fucking reality TV star that was an asshole, and the worst, most racist thing that he did up until that point, as far as I can remember, is the whole the what's it called, the New York Five or whatever, the kids that got in trouble. There was a Netflix movie about it. I forget exactly. Yeah. The Central Park Five. That's their name, right? Like, there is nothing like the crime bill. There's nothing like lying us to getting to war, millions of fucking Iraqi people, and all the people that say that they care about like the refugees. It's like, so for me, that goes to that generational thing. We're even having this gap in this conversation because you were what? So I was in my 20s when the Iraq war was happening. You were like 12 years old, right? So your understanding of it comes from a pre-critical thought, access to critical thought.
My personal understanding and my personal experience comes from that, but that doesn't mean that people of my generation shouldn't be expected to be engaging in critical thought and reading and trying to unpack the lies that were necessarily that were being fed to us at the time.
But we have new lies to worry about.
Yeah.
And for me to come here and tell you, yo, there was some bad lies. How the fuck? Like that's how this is a generational trap that I'm talking about, right? Like there were older people, boomers, that told me that this was a fucking one-party country. And I was like, nah, I don't believe you. And I just didn't have the tools. And it wasn't that I wasn't like, it's just, I had only been exposed to propaganda for a certain amount of time.
Right.
It takes you a fucking long time to realize like I'm entirely wrong about everything.
I do feel this optimism that generational gaps are going to continue feeling more and more pressing. Like they're I think generational gaps maybe in the past were not as visible because they were brushed under the rug, but generational gaps is being used as a tool of recognition, and the idea that like elder millennials can be helping a younger millennial understand like this is an experience that we had. Where were you on what were your thoughts about 9/11 and how can you unpack that and understand the world, but still understand that you're seeing that under like the framework of a millennial, that you were so young that you couldn't have critical thought about what was happening. It was sold to you, it was packaged to you.
No, I'm saying that this is I'm not at all. I'm saying that this is like a trap of fate, right? Like I'm not holding anyone accountable. This is sort of like I'm not losing hope in any generation. I am fully aware that these people are capable of getting to where I am. But my concern is this. I have been you've envisioned yourself as a teacher of art, and then you realized that you didn't want to do academia. I didn't really want to be a fucking teacher of art, right? Like I was convinced that I did, but when it came down to it and I was like, what am I going to get in debt for something to compete with people that I'm going to be I was coaching soccer. I was making as much money as a fucking adjunct, right? Mm-hmm. And it was fucking crazy to me. Like at this point, I'm ready to sell out a little bit, like, man. I'm tired of fighting. And so by the time the people catch up to where I'm at, they're also going to be ready to sell out a little bit.
Well,
right?
I think that there's a trend to that right now, especially with what we've been dealing with COVID, because it feels like we can critique capitalism from within capitalism, because the alternative is basically either bugging out, like living as a prepper off the grid, which I love as a subculture, and I've researched a lot into that. But like the alternative
I can see you.
Oh man, that was a lot of grad school was researching that subculture and like all of the flaws that come.
But go ahead, finish your point.
Just, I feel like right now we're all so tired of fighting and reconciling and recognizing and just being like, we can critique capitalism and what it's done to completely destroy our lives, but we still have to live within it right now, or we die, or we, get gobbled up, or like, who can afford to leave the country, right? Like who's just like, I'm just going to go. Oh, if you can afford to leave the country, there's a chance that maybe capitalism is not negatively impacting you the way that it is for people who can't afford to leave the country. So go back to wherever you're from is such like a ridiculous premise just to start with, you know?
Well, this is one of the things that I always find interesting about talking to like people that are American, right? Because America, the history for like a Latin American person and the relationship to America is very complicated. We have more privilege than anybody who has who doesn't have a passport, right? Like any Cuban who can't come to the U.S. right now, like I'm way better off, right? But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, right? Like there have been periods where we've allowed we've lifted the blockade and there were businesses flourishing. Fast and the Furious film down there, you know, like the Rolling Stones played a concert there. Like, you know, like there was a moment where it looked like we were going to fucking, let people live. Right. And so
are you frozen too? Are you there?
Yeah, I think something blinked out. Can you hear me at all?
I wanted so badly to record that because it was just you saying the word do over and over again. It was like kind of actually incredible. I'm bummed I didn't whip my phone out fast enough.
So I don't know why my screen isn't working. I still have everything set up correctly. But anyway, we've been talking for like an hour and a half, so we can start wrapping up. Looks like we're still recording. Why the fuck is my screen?
Oh yeah.
Oh, I think I can unmute my video. It's still not showing.
I mean, seriously, you could do like a lecture series on so many of these different topics that you're passionate about, and it feels almost limiting in some ways to think about it as like a new conversation that you have to start with a new person every time that you start an episode of What's My Thesis. It's like, it's so incredible to offer that ability to meet people and hear about what they're really passionate about. But then at the same time, you're like, I really want to dig into some of these topics. And
what do you mean?
I just feel like so many of these separate different like topics that we've talked about could be, you know, entire chapters of your perspective on these things and how they are impacted by the people that you talk to and about your own personal experience. I mean, I would love to hear more about your experience being Cuban American and
the only thing this is just kind of comes up. I've had guests on that we talked to. We talked a lot in depth about this. So this is like I kind of wanted to talk to you about this stuff because I know we've hinted that we kind of are in the same space in terms of like lefty politics.
Yeah.
And I definitely, you know, the older I get, the less I'm convinced that I know everything, right? And
we know nothing, yeah.
but that's what is so infuriating to me about people right now is that everybody's so fucking certain, and then like a few months later, it's like, oh no, that was complete bullshit. Like the Hunter Biden story. Hunter Biden, like the laptop shit was real, and it's been acknowledged, and it was suppressed. Fucking a journalist left. Glenn Greenwald left The Intercept because they weren't going to let him publish a story in the fucking paper he founded off of his reputation for doing the Snowden leaks. And so like, to me, that shit is crazy because it's like, it's more about being on the right side of like what the popular, like it's just being one of the cool kids. Right.
I'll send you that video that I found, because it was just like a really nice summation of exactly like the trending cyclical, you know, canceling, and then tribalism that erupts from that, and like the assumption, the presumption that you know what it is that you're so up in arms about is usually wrong. Like it's usually just like somebody's lying to you, and like.
And that's why I get I'm starting to get frustrated at myself for being frustrated when people are propagandized.
True.
Like,
true.
you know,
Yeah.
like, why the fuck is that triggering me? That
Right.
doesn't help me. But anyway, I do want to wrap it up because I don't know why my camera's not working. I can, and then I also wanted to end on this thing. I am not saying you can't have sex with an 18-year-old. Please. I'm saying.
I was 18 once. I had sex. It was not with older men, but
I'm saying you can be 70 and fuck an 18-year-old. I don't give a fuck. If you do it, you like, I'm just saying, don't do it in a place where you have intrinsic high value and power over somebody that's interested in learning the fucking thing. Like, that's all I'm saying. Like, you know, like, and if you groomed a college student and married her, like, good for you. I'm not fucking trying to fuck with your hustle. I'm just saying, as an institution, like, maybe we should analyze. You're the only case where I think that that's okay. If you're listening to this, right?
Yeah, I mean, I just like, if a theme of critical thinking is a thing here, I think that critical thinking being applied to power structures is not being just like a thing that we ignore. I think could be the takeaway. Like,
I'm saying,
nice little wrapping it up of
go
like,
seduce all the 18-year-olds you want. I'm gonna try too. Don't get me wrong, but
we're looking for our 18-year-old unicorn. That's what the situation is.
Yeah. Well, I'm not in a relationship, so I don't need a unicorn. I need a single lady. It doesn't even have to be that complicated. No, I'm saying I would probably not be able to like date them long term, and they would get bored of listening to me talk about my old man shit.
Sometimes you luck out with a relationship that starts when you're 19, and you get really lucky in that they, you know, how many years later still can put up with your constant ramblings about, it's been really like, Billy will walk past me while I'm in my therapy and he's just like, all I can hear is you yelling about capitalism and cops and the world. And he's just like, that's just Emily being, don't even talk to me about when any sort of intoxicants get involved in the party. And it's a mess. That should be something that we do at some point if you are down, because I feel like that would be really fun.
What to do to get drunk or smoke weed or what? We're still recording, by the way, just for FYI. So before you forget that my screen is black. But
is weed legal here in Los Angeles?
I don't know. Do you have parents that might judge you for that? I don't know.
Well, if my one parent watched this already,
they would be much more offended by
there would be a lot of other things before this that are making me think like, I can't really share this, which is really sad. But yeah, there's things that came earlier
that I said or that you said.
That I said. Like,
okay. I was like, wow, man. I hope I don't. Now I understand what you're saying.
We're all only responsible for what we ourselves can do and say, right? Like.
But the last note: my grandparents are also 12 years apart. And my grandfather met my grandmother when he was 22 and she was 12. They didn't start dating until later, but that's still fucking weird.
My mom and dad were like 5 years apart. That was fine. I feel like everybody has been like relatively close in age, which, you know, I just don't have like a personal. Yeah. I have friends that have like varying degrees of these relationships, and like I'm so happy for them. So I don't have any horse in this race.
I'm totally doing a bit, but also not.
I mean, like, power structure as being a thing that we should be cognizant of, I think is a really good thing to think about, especially when it comes to deconstructing academia and like the premise of academia as being like the end all be all of how to educate ourselves on various ideas. The most exciting relationship that I have in my family history, I think, is my great grandpa was living in Texas and met a woman who had fled Cuba. Cuba was
fled is correct.
Fled. Thank you. Short-term memory loss and word usage throughout COVID has really been a thing. And I learned from this woman, the Golden Dome school she was at OPAF, where she was like, it's okay. This is like a thing that we're all experiencing. Like people forgetting each other's proper nouns, and like, it's apparently a thing, which is really comforting. But, yeah, he didn't speak any Spanish and she didn't speak any English, and they fell in love and had a beautiful relationship until both of them died shortly within each other. Like, just a real interesting.
Did they ever learn how to communicate?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Or was that the bliss of their marriage?
I mean, they were old at this point. Like they were grandparents at this point.
Oh, okay.
So, like, they found love as grandparents, even like, so it's not like they were both like, total stunners. And I mean, they were good looking people, but
I love how I share like a really dark story about my grandparents being like inappropriately aged. And you're like, the sweet story that we
you'll have to just come by and we'll get a little bit loosey-goosey, and then I'll just
you tell me about all the trauma, dude,
all the terrible stuff. Yeah.
I've said this before. I've literally on several occasions had to tell my father to stop telling me a story because it was upsetting me of his childhood. Because he was like unaware of his unaware that he's like nostalgic about trauma. Yeah. And I'm like, yeah, dude, that's child abuse.
Know the trauma or not know the trauma? Because I've had both situations where it's like, God, I wish you had told me this like 10 years ago, or, oh my God, please don't tell me this story again because it's so upsetting. Like,
I think it's more of like, my dad does not know how fucked up his childhood was and how mistreated it was. And I don't want to hear it because it breaks my heart.
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, generational trauma and like the whole idea of how much we inherit from that, like in our DNA, is like such a fascinating study. All of that being like even just the obvious things about what we inherit, as far as like what I was talking about earlier with like inheriting the ethics of the place that you were brought up in, that totally extends to the people that you were brought up with. And like, yeah, I think like I'm really optimistic about my role as being a cycle breaker. Like I am capable of not perpetuating my family lineage, and therefore all of the trauma that was inherited. Like I think that that's an aspect of optimism that I find in the world. Like I can contribute to less humans being born, and I can also stop cycles of trauma and abuse. And, cool. That's an optimistic sort of thing to be happy about.
Well, yeah, I can definitely stop hearing my dad's trauma too, because that shit is intense. It is crazy what the world like. Sometimes it's hard to even think of what the world is like. Like just in our lifetime, we're talking about how much it's changed, even with just Monica Lewinsky and our perspective on her. Yeah. The other thing that's funny about Bill Clinton is like the 5 things that they used to say were his biggest achievements were like NAFTA. What's it called? The like welfare reform, a whole bunch of things that were just like the crime bill. That's 3 out of 5 that I can remember. I can't remember all of them, but like I see, based on the expression that I'm getting from your face, it's clear that you are not in the same space that we were back when people were like, hey, he was a great president. We should have known something was wrong with Clinton when Republicans started liking him, even though, they're like, yeah, he's not too bad. That's because he just did all of their shit. They couldn't, George W. Bush couldn't pass NAFTA. It had to be, Herbert Walker Bush couldn't pass NAFTA. It had to be Bill Clinton.
We had to reach across the aisle.
You know what my first election? Do you know what my first election was?
Which one?
Hanging Chads. 2000 were Al Gore. Oh, see, that's another generational joke that you didn't catch.
Nope.
Hanging Chads. When they were doing the recount, there was a whole thing.
The Florida ticketing system. Yeah. Okay. It was not part of my vernacular at the time because I was a child. But yeah, I think about that moment in history a lot. What our world would be like if Al Gore had been able to accomplish what he had. And like, I don't even know enough about him to think.
I don't think anything would have changed.
Right. Exactly. Like, because we're a one-party system, because like everything is predicated on the success of the ruling party, and it has been, and ever maybe
actually that
will be.
I just contradicted myself because I don't know. I do think that it's hard to quantify Dick Cheney and what would have I may be retracting my idea that like that Bush presidency was really bad. That's where all the wars that we're in started. We were you guys, I don't know if you know this. Hey, but we were not in any wars until George W. Bush took office.
Except for the war on drugs, and except for the war on poverty, and except for the war on women, which was totally...
Yeah, but you can't kill those except for women.
You can kill through so many alternative methods by allowing the zeitgeist to think that it's...
Oh, no, you can also just kill women. We do that all the time.
Yeah.
Like that's not, we sterilize them. We're not good.
The war on AIDS, which was just the war of homophobe. Like, yeah, I mean, like we were just more...
Was there a war on AIDS? I don't remember that phrasing. That seems pretty harsh.
I'm being loose with that sort of terminology and applying it to what like was in actuality.
I think the problem is that there was no war on AIDS.
Well, there was a war on homosexuality, and that was...
Do you know what they used to call AIDS?
What?
GRID. Do you know what GRID stands for?
I feel like I've learned this before and it's not on the tip of my tongue.
Gay-related immunodeficiency syndrome.
Right. Yeah. And luckily there's been enough media that's being highly recognized and discussed right now that's like educating people on how horrible the war on drugs and the war, on everything that happened regarding AIDS. Like
Biden is expanding it. All right, we'll stop there. I'm sorry.
I'm going to go back to mold making where I can control my own little world.
I'm not going to be invited to any of your parties.
No. We'll have our own separate parties, which is, I've really liked that new thing with like COVID being like smaller gatherings where like you trust the person, they've been, doing whatever they need to do to be safe and whatever. Like there's like an opening of discussion of consent, and like I love that. And then like you get together with one or two other people and you're like so hungry for, having these conversations, and then you get a little weed in you and you're all of a sudden having like this conversation that you're like, I've been wanting to have this conversation for years and years, and it feels so good. That's a future vision that I want to have, is like getting together with people and having these conversations, and like what that then can lead to,
But not with me, because I don't do drugs.
Oh, well, I'll just do it. And you.
No, I'm kidding. I do a lot of drugs. I did a whole episode on how much of a degenerate I was.
I knew that, but I thought maybe I was starting to like try to preserve your mystique. You're like,
no, I have no mystique. God damn, I have absolutely no mystique.
Oh yeah.
That's why it's gonna be okay when I sleep with a groupie, because they're gonna know me on the inside.
Right. And how do you address the power dynamic of you not knowing them? It's gonna be all about them getting to.
Well, the problem here with this scenario is that it's all fantasy. The idea of me having groupies, I barely have listeners. Anyone that would listen that intently, like I'd be like, oh my God, you were meant to be my wife. No, I'm kidding.
It's amazing what communities have been popping up around podcast personalities and like talent though these days. Like I am a fan of a couple different podcasts. Ologies. Have you heard about Ologies? I think I rambled.
We don't plug other shows on the show. Sorry.
Oh shit.
No, I'm totally joking.
Oh my God. Like I've plugged how many other things?
This is no longer an episode. We should wrap it up. We're just talking shit at this point.
My dog is so impatient with me. He's like, when are you going to come and play? I also haven't eaten anything from
This is why I would eat dogs, because they just like, their personality is so needy. I'll be like, you can be inside me, pup.
But he does so much for me in like terms of other things. He gives a lot to me. I'm a little obsessed. I couldn't eat him.
Oh, I would just, like I would raise pigs like they do in Italy. I would raise the dogs the same way. They have happy lives, and then they don't see it coming, and then wham.
Oh. Oh. I can't flinch if I eat pork, right? Like that's another like the prioritizing of human life over like what we view as being particular life forms or types of human life that are like better than others. It's all just a myth that we allowed to be able to sleep at night, like
I spent a lot of time in dark places, especially true crime related dark places. So I don't mean to shock you, but I'm also fully aware that in a pinch, I would be a cannibal if I was part of the.
I was the one who brought up eating human flesh out of a petri dish. You think that I'm like
no, but I'm just saying. I just know what my boundaries are. I would totally snuggle up with a dog and eat it. Raise it until it's nice and fat. It's just it's just I don't like dog meat. But you get what I'm saying? Like, it's like I think also bear meat is supposed to not be very good. It's like supposed to be really greasy. So there's like my point is I'm not going to eat a fucking dog unless it tastes as good as a pig.
A really good point. I was just looking at somebody cooking beef early. We've been doing like somewhat intermittent fasting, which sounds like a crazy person thing, but like
it does.
It's great. It's been really lovely. It's been
it's LA crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
It sounds like a Joe Rogan type shit.
Yeah. I'm also doing like a whole body of work right now when I was talking about like the idea of living in the past and then trying to make a house for myself in the future. I'm doing this whole like futuristic like sort of critiquing the idea of manifestation through like trying to find ways of engaging in with it, similarly to how I researched the prepper culture. Like I'm very interested in like immersing myself into certain thought patterns in like a very like just dipping my toe in sort of thing. But the manifesting of like a futuristic art myth that I'm creating for myself. I would love to share a press release that I wrote for myself at some point that will be part of my show at Elephant.
You're showing at Elephant? Nice.
Yeah, I'm very grateful to Ostry for, it's something I've been really looking forward to because I haven't really had any solo exhibitions and I haven't had a lot of group exhibition opportunities for a little while. So like, I've just been learning and like working on this whole mold making thing. So I'm not upset. I'm very grateful and optimistic that I'm going to have a really good time preparing for this show in May. And I wrote this press release that's very futuristic and sort of like manifesty sort of energy. And
have you ever read any of the Futurist Manifestos?
Yeah.
Those are my favorite. The podcast started with a discussion about futurists. The first episode is about futurists. I'm a huge fan. They're Italian fascists.
Yeah.
Very interesting group of people.
I mean,
very naive.
The manifesto movement was a whole thing that we got really into studying in grad school, thinking about like what that means to write a manifesto and to like hold power in those words. I guess I'm kind of writing my own like little futuristic manifesto. Maybe I'm internally a fascist and.
No, I mean, actually, there's a movement in sci-fi right now that is trying to undo the dystopian works of like people. I think William Gibson is also on board for this, but like basically what a lot of sci-fi or what this movement in sci-fi is thinking is that maybe they led us here by writing such dark and dystopian tales, and that they're trying to like maybe imagine a less upsetting future. Although, man, I would never give Snow Crash up. Have you ever read that book?
Mm-mm.
It's Neil Stephenson. It's about it's essentially about anarcho-capitalism, which is I think ultimately is where we're headed. It's like we're even in my neighborhood, there's no police force. There's a private security force that operates.
Cool.
What's that?
I said cool. Cool.
Yeah. And I've had some pretty weird experiences with them.
Can you tell me the name of that book one more time?
Snow Crash. It's one of my favorites. It's very well known, and it's like it reads like an action book. And
look at that, Libby. There we go.
Nice. Oh, you're gonna get it from the bookstore. Nice.
Yeah.
Oh, not the bookstore. From the yeah. It's a great read. It's or a great listen to. I'm sure it's super exciting. There's fast cars and pizza delivery and mafia and
it'll be a nice break from a lot of like the nonfiction that I've been.
Like I said, I highly recommend it. Neil Stephenson is one of my favorite authors. And yeah, I definitely highly recommend that. And I'm excited if you read it because we're going to talk mad shit about it.
Yeah.
But, again, I'm just going to remind everybody it's okay to sleep with 18-year-olds. As long as they consent. I do love playing with you a little bit now. Now that I know.
I had a coworker one time that said that Midwesterners have very like consistently puckered buttholes, and I was so offended. And then I was like, oh fuck, what if that's real? Like, what if we're all just consistently just like in this state of like being just shocked, and even if we're not actually shocked internally, that we portray this attitude of being like, oh, we're so wholesome, we can't handle any sort of risque humor. Like, what's worse? I
am also kind of pulling it up from like trying to end the episode with that is a little unfair on my part. Anyway, let's say goodbye to all the listeners. Is there anything that we can promote for you? Your Instagram is at Emily Blythe Jones, right? Are there any underscores?
Nope, just my name. And I'm going to be rolling out business plans within hopefully, months.
If this becomes an MLM, I'm going to be so excited.
I mean, what is the educational system if not an MLM? I have
do you have a website?
Family history with MLM, so you're triggering me. Thank you. Yeah, my website is just Emily B. Jones. That's it .com. But I haven't really been very good at updating that.
That's just assumed when we plug the website. In fact,
I think we're gonna do a Patreon model, maybe, or
your
something.
Website?
But I'll definitely,
the
for the educational platform.
Okay, I have some people that I can show you. That actually the artist that I was telling you that resigned because she was asked to fix someone's grade.
Oh, I would be very grateful for that. I need some good like role models to look towards to help.
I'm not going to plug the school right now because I just gave up some very personal information. It's Harvard.
Oh! Thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure.
This massive shit talking sesh was great.
Next time, this was your warm up. Next time, you're gonna be like, Javier, let me tell you all the hot goss.
I have so much hot gas. Oh my god.
All right.
What did you think of our conversation? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out our merch store. Special thanks to our patrons. To become a patron, go to patreon.com/whatsmythesis. All the links are in the description below.